Hey everyone, Jen here, and today we're going to talk a little bit about how we can improve our descriptive ability. Now, when we're talking about descriptive language in this video, we're talking about it within the context of beer, but you can apply these skills to evaluating anything from chocolate to cheese to wine. So when we're talking about ways to describe beer, today we're going to talk about three specific ways. These are not the only ways, but they are the ones that we'll encounter most often. And those are hedonics, quantitative language, and qualitative language. So let's start with hedonics. Very broadly speaking, hedonics is really a measure of how much we like or dislike something. So I'm sure you've probably filled out those surveys before that ask you to rate an experience or a product on some sort of a numerical scale. That's known as a hedonic scale. Now, when we do this as beer drinkers, we actually do it all the time. So think about someone who says, I don't like IPAs when they're too bitter, or I really like sour beers. Those are examples of hedonic descriptions of beer. Now, within the context of judging or taking an exam, we really don't want to use very much hedonic language because it's highly subjective and personal and doesn't really convey that much information to the receiver of that. One of the exceptions to that is when you're in a judging atmosphere and you have areas on a score sheet, such as the overall impression, where you're able to share how much you liked the beer or how nice the color looked. So in certain situations, using hedonic language when evaluating beer is appropriate. So then the next kind of language we're going to talk about is quantitative language. When we're talking about quantitative language, we're talking about objective, measurable attributes. For beer, this includes things such as ABV, IBU, and SRM. Now, we're humans, not lab instruments, so we really don't need to worry about trying to communicate our perceptions about beer using quantitative language. And, another part of that too is because we're not lab instruments, we're probably not going to be correct if we try to communicate our perceptions about beer using quantitative language. So examples of this would be if you told somebody to consider lowering their IBUs by 3 to 5 IBUs, or if you describe the color as a beer as being 2 to 3 SRM. So we're not really going to use hedonic language very often when we're evaluating beer. We're not going to try to use quantitative language. What we are going to focus on is qualitative language. And with qualitative language, what we're talking here about is our descriptive vocabulary. And these are the subjective attributes of beer. And that's going to include talking about your perceptions on aroma, appearance, flavor, and mouthfeel. And our descriptive ability is going to improve with experience, but the great news is that all of us already have this huge wealth of descriptors based on our lived experiences that we can use when we're talking about what we're perceiving with beer. So when you're evaluating beer using qualitative language, you want to be as specific as you can be about what you're perceiving. Now, you don't want to be so specific that you're describing something that very few, if anyone, will understand what you're communicating, but you also don't want to be so broad and vague that you're really not communicating that much at all. So an example of being very broad or very vague is to describe a beer as having a malty or a hoppy flavor. Now, the caveat to that is if you're new to describing your perceptions of beer, if you're new to judging beer, understanding, being able to tell that there are malt flavors and hop flavors in a beer is a great place to start. But just understand that as you improve your descriptive vocabulary, you'll be able to build on that. So when we're talking about our descriptive vocabulary, the two most important things we want to keep in mind is talking about what kind and how much. And so the what kind part we already kind of talked about just now, where you want to be very specific as you can be while still communicating valuable information. The other thing we want to practice as beer evaluators is talking about the intensity of the attribute. So this is where our descriptors for, low, medium, high, assertive, pronounced, that's where these descriptors come in. And the more that you practice evaluating beer and describing it to others, the more you'll get better at being able to evaluate the intensity of the components within the beer as they relate to each other. So that's great news. You know, the way you can improve is to continue practicing. So remember, when you're perceiving beer, that you are the best judge of what it is that you're tasting. Now, again, you know, your skill in communicating your perceptions will improve as you gain more experience, and the more that you're mindfully evaluating beer and, you know, and as well as describing it to others. So we'll all continue to improve the more that we practice. But remember that the taste of the beer is not in the beer itself, it's in us, and it's in all of our abilities to draw on those personal lived experiences to be able to describe what we're tasting. And you know, the key to evaluating beer isn't what's in the glass, it's your perceptions and what you do with those perceptions. So with that, thank you very much for joining me on learning a little bit about how we can improve our descriptive ability for when it comes to evaluating beer. If there's any other beer sensory topics you're interested in learning more about in the future, feel free to let me know. Cheers, everyone.